I'm making this video today for a few reasons. There's a lot of newcomers to the Turbo Buick community lately. Some people are just buying them, or some have had them for years as stock cars, but they're looking to start the modification process now. Some people are acquiring cars that are full of modifications and they have the ability and the potential to go real fast, but they might have a few bugs or things that need to be ironed out to get to that point. Just because it's handed off from the previous owner without any real information on how to actually work the car. So we're going to make a video today to try to tackle some of those things. I see questions every single day, and when I say every day, I mean I think every single day I see questions asked that are in some way related to tuning these cars. Sometimes it's an air fuel question, or a chip or turbo tweak style chip question, or ECM related question. A lot of times it's knock retard related, meaning that somebody's seeing knock retard on their ScanMaster. They don't know why or how to solve it or how to fix it. A lot of times that's related to the tune, and people don't really have the information on how to correct that in the tune, but they have the ability to do it. They just don't have the information. So we're definitely going to tackle that right now so that we have a resource to go back to and reference on how to fix that problem. If a car has detonation, that is why you'd have knock retard, and that's a reason to understand why to tune it. People have questions about the ScanMaster, or just generally speaking, how to make the car faster and perform better. And the tune is obviously the most important place to do that. So we have to have that information available to us, or we're going to have poor running turbo eagles out there, and we can't have that happen. This video will be geared towards beginners and possible intermediates that may already be out there with their cars, but just don't really know the fundamentals of how to get into the chip and add and subtract fuel and do things like that. So stick around. There's going to be a few parts to this video, so stick it out if you're really interested in learning how to work your turbo eagle on a different level. But yeah, let's get into this video, and the next thing we'll do is talk about the tools that you need or should have when doing this job. Before you even think about the idea of abusing your car and trying to tune it and trying to make more power or trying to do anything for that matter, these are some of the things that you really should have done and behind you and taken care of. Because without all these things, number one, you really won't have the ability to tune the car the same way. Number two, you could be right on the verge of disaster with detonation and a lack of fuel. These cars really, I can't stress enough, they really rely on fuel, because you're dumping air into the motor and spark into the motor, and there needs to be enough fuel to compensate for that stuff. So you have to feed these motors with fuel. So number one, you should have an aftermarket or replacement pump in the back of the car. If you have a 35-plus-year-old stock fuel pump in your car, you have no business trying to tune the car for any reason. You should take the pump out of the car, and you should reach out to one of these Buick vendors, and you should at least at the minimum have a 255 GPH pump. And I say that because a 255 pump is inexpensive. It's probably $100. They're easy to put in the car. You drop the tank, you take the old one out, you just replace it. There's nothing you even have to do. You put it in and you can go fast on a 255. I've seen people say they've gone into the mid-10s with a 255 pump. I'm really just an 11-second car. If I ever hit the 10 someday, I'm sure I'll be on the verge of changing this pump out. It's something I definitely would like to do. That is the next pump up, would be a 340. I've ran those before. If you have goals of going fast in these cars and going low 11s and high 10s or faster, you should just start with a 340 pump right off the bat. The downside to that is you do have to change your return line because it's too thin and your fuel pressure will be too high, and you won't be able to adjust the fuel pressure accordingly. So you do have to mess around with your fuel lines if you go to a 340 or higher. And some people might debate that, and who knows, maybe they're right, but the fact is you should probably change your return line, and I'm almost positive that you do actually have to change it to go to a 340. I've done it in the past, ran a whole new feed line and used the old factory feed line as a return line because it goes up from, I think, 5/16 over to 3/8. So now you have 2 3/8 line, so you can move the fuel from the front to the back of the car efficiently and have proper amounts of fuel pressure, not too much excessive fuel pressure. Other than that, they have pumps out there with double pumps and one hanger, and now the Hellcat pump is the big pump that everybody wants. But Honestly, I have a 255 in my car and it runs great. It's really, idles beautiful. No problems with the 255 pump for now. So if you don't have that, you should stop right now and go to some website and buy yourself a 255 pump or better. But assuming you have that, the next thing that you should have before tuning these cars and trying to make power is a hot wire kit. And if you don't know what a hot wire kit is, or you don't have one on your car, again, for the amount of money it costs, which might be, honestly I haven't bought one in so long I forget, can't be more than $150. Maybe it's as cheap as $60 or $80. It's really about a 15-foot spool of wires that you'll run from your alternator back to the fuel pump, and it's plug and play, and it probably takes a half hour to put on if you're doing a nice job and lumen it up nice. And all it does is, instead of your fuel pump running off the factory harness and the factory electric system, you're now piggybacking it to the alternator so that the fuel pump gets the same voltage that the alternator gets. So if you go wide open throttle and your voltage on your alternator peaks at 14, we'll say 14 volts, that goes straight back to the fuel pump and gives the fuel pump the energy it needs to keep up with the fuel system and the demand for fuel. A hot wire kit on these cars is a must. And I did add there Casper's Electronics and the company called Racetronics. Both of them are the ones that supply the hot wire kits for these cars. I've used both, I think, on several different cars, and both of them are great. There's no problems with either of them, so get yourself a hot wire kit. Hopefully you already have one. The next thing you need is fuel injectors. Everybody pretty much has some sort of aftermarket fuel injector on their car. 42s are fine. They'll take you into the 12s and probably, I'm sure, into the 11s. When you go to the Turbo Tweak website, you can buy a chip and injector combo, and then the chip matches the injectors. And we'll talk about that chip in just a minute. But your injectors are important because they're going to be able to feed the fuel, feed the motor the supply of fuel that it needs, and keep up with the demand for fuel that you're now tuning the motor to bring more fuel into the motor. So then injectors need to be able to keep up with that. So I have 60-pound injectors in my car, and they match the chip. Some people have 80-pound injectors, and even bigger than that. There is I'm sure, a debate, a conversation to be had about bigger injectors, but I've found the smaller injector, I like the way the car rides around and idles. It really feels like a stock car until you get in it. So I never really went with larger than necessary injectors. The next thing you need when you're tuning your car, and you probably already have this, unless your car is completely stock, these things are a must. Like I said, this whole list here is a must. Even if you don't have big goals for your car, this stuff helps dial your car in and get it running efficiently, and will keep it up running good forever, really. You should have a fuel pressure regulator. And a fuel pressure regulator, if you're not familiar with it, replaces your factory regulator, but gives you the ability to change the amount of fuel supply that the motor can receive. The main thing to talk about when tuning this car is the Turbo Tweak chip. So this whole video is going to be based around the average guy going on Turbo Tweak's website, filling out the form, and ordering a very simple Turbo Tweak chip. Most people have this chip already. It's the most common chip on the market. The average person can go spend $89 or whatever it is and get a Turbo Tweak chip, and I'll show you one in just a second. So what I have here is a list of available tuning options that are available to us after you have all the stuff that we just talked about. So there's nothing advanced about any of this. We're not talking about having an XFI or some sort of programmable engine management where you can go into the timing tables and write new volumetric efficiency tables and things like that. We're not that advanced here. This is the average guy with an average GN, with the average stuff that you can get offline for inexpensive amounts of money, and making an average tune that works in your car and that is safe. So let's go over that stuff. The first thing is very simple. Your boost knob and your boost gauge to control your boost pressure. All this means is turning the boost up and down. Number two is fuel pressure. Again, we talked about having the fuel pressure regulator. That will allow you to change the amount of fuel pressure that the car sees. Number three, this third one is your chip. We talked about that, and to be more specific, I put it in writing so that you can see the difference in what's available inside this chip. Remember, these are the things that the average guy can tune. There's nothing advanced about this. You can set your boost, You can set your fuel pressure, and you can go inside your chip, and you can change these 4 parameters. Your wide open throttle fuel. Now, I'm going to say something about that right now. Recently, I saw a guy was trying to diagnose some problems with his car. And if you're watching this, you'll know who you are. I had mentioned that you really need to read your wideband gauge or your scan master and see how much wide open throttle fuel your motor's getting so that it's getting enough fuel. And he was under the impression that looking at his fuel pressure gauge, that it was rising with boost. It was seeing a proper amount of fuel pressure. The problem there is that's the fuel pressure going into the motor. That doesn't tell us how the motor actually processes the fuel and how much fuel the motor's using, whether it be not enough fuel or too much fuel. So fuel pressure for the letter B there really has nothing to do with wide open throttle fuel under the chip parameter. Those are 2 completely different things. You definitely need fuel pressure, but then after that, you can go into the chip and talk about adjusting your actual consumption of fuel in the motor. So again, we'll go more into detail on that when we talk about the fuel pressure gauge, and we'll show you an actual in-car video of how the fuel pressure gauge works and also how the chip wide open throttle fuel is affected by the change in the chip. Now, the 3 other things after wide open throttle fuel are a little debatable. I don't really use them yet. I plan to someday down the road when I really want to dial the car in at the track, but frankly, it's more of a street car. It works really good on the street. I don't get to the track that often, and I don't really like to push the car because while I'd like to see it have a really fast pass, it's not the end all to be all. It's not my biggest priority. My biggest priority is probably just keeping the car alive and never really having to replace head gaskets for no reason. So this video is really about doing that. So number 2 there is the first gear fuel, which means that you can override number 1, which is the wide open throttle fuel, and change your first gear fuel consumption. And the reason you'd want to do that is if you go to the racetrack and you launch the car from the line, you can actually lean the car out in first gear so that it launches real hard, spools up real quick, and gets a killer 60 foot. And first gear happens so fast in these cars with the gear ratio in the 204R transmission that you come out of first gear so fast and go into second that it can dump a bunch more fuel in the motor, and you don't really have to worry about the car leaning out and stuff like that. So that's a tuning tool really for that atmosphere at the track. It's not something you'd really want to, I don't think you'd want to be tuning that out on the street in a regular daily driving car. That's a performance gain there. Number 3 is your timing. Now, when you get a chip, you fill out an application and you give them all your information, and the guy who runs Turbo Buick, he will set your chip with the proper amount of timing in it. So you really should never have to change that timing unless you're going into kind of an advanced tuning situation where there's a lot of different reasons you would do that, but it's more of an advanced situation where you're pulling timing from the car or adding timing to the car. And number 4 is the same thing. It's only in 3rd gear and 4th gear. So the chip gives you the ability to go in and change its default settings for timing in all the gears. But again, the default setting is usually the best amount of timing you can have in the car, unless there's some reason you're going in there to change the timing. I rarely, if ever, go in and change my timing. There are some reasons why I would maybe do it, but again, it's not something I think that you'll find yourself doing very often, unless you're doing some advanced tuning and trying to pull real extra horsepower out of the car. Then you can start looking at your timing tables and changing those. If you're a true beginner to these cars, you probably don't know or haven't even seen one of these chips in person. If you have been around them a while and you've been through chips and changed chips and you've got that far at least, this is nothing new. But I'm going to show what one of these chips looks like. This is actually right in your passenger compartment by your footwell. There's a little plastic cover, and you disassemble and you pull your ECM out, and there's a little 7mm, 2 little nuts on there, and you take the cover off and you can access your prom chip. Okay, and that's what it'll look just like this. So when Turbo Buick sends you a new chip, you basically just get one of these. Okay, this one right here, I'm just picking this one up out of my collection of chips that I've had over the years. This one is, you can see it says Turbo Buick TT version 5.7. which is what we talked about. The number in the right is the serial number. Now this chip is specifically burned for 60-pound injectors and alcohol injection, which I have on this car. Not everybody needs that. It's definitely probably one of the best mods you can ever do to these cars. So if anybody wants to know more about alcohol injection, just comment. We can definitely talk about that. But because I have alcohol injection in this car, this chip has enough fuel map to it to compensate and allow for the extra added fuel coming into the motor, which is about 20% of fuel. But that's more advanced stuff that we don't need to talk about right now. So this assumes that there's alcohol coming into the motor, so there's already fuel taken out of this. Again, when you set them up with Turbo Tweak, he goes over all your parameters and builds the chip to your fuel program and what you need to do. Now on the bottom there, you'll see 22/20. So my understanding about that is, obviously I know it's the timing, but I think it's timing across the board. Maybe in first and second gear is 22 degrees of timing, and in high gear it's at 20 degrees of timing. And I believe they lowered the timing in high gear because the cars are real heavy going down the track, and there's no gear ratio really propelling the car. You're in 1-to-1 if you're in third gear, so you really have nothing propelling the car. It's just all steam from the motor and power and pulling that weight down the track. So you want to pull a little bit of timing out just to keep it safe. So that's why they always do a little bit less timing in high gear. On the right, you'll see the boost amount that this chip is burnt for, which is 22 to 24 pounds of boost. This chip, same thing, a little bit more timing, 23, 21. Yep, a little bit more timing. And this one's burnt for only 20 pounds of boost. So again, if I lower my boost in my car to 20 pounds, I'll put that chip in, and then I won't really have to do anything because by default, the chip programmer has programmed the proper amount of fuel for this car. If I put 25 pounds, or I'm sorry, 23 or 24 pounds of boost, I can put this chip in and I don't have to do anything. But that goes back to the whole reason we're making this video. Suppose I have a chip in there right now, which for example, I have a chip in there right now that's set for 27 pounds of boost. If I turn my boost down right now to a lower number like 23 or 22, there's going to be entirely too much fuel going into the motor because it's assuming that we're going to be seeing 27 pounds of boost. So the chip programmer has designed the chip to put enough fuel in there to supply 27 pounds of boost, but I've lowered the boost down to 23. So now you're going to have entirely too much fuel. So that's, I think, what we're going to cover is how to go into this chip and change the fuel map for different reasons that you would do that. And I think I'm going to give you some examples of why you would be inside of this chip changing the fuel map. So when we go out with the car and we try to show you how exactly to work the chip and do the tuning of the car, which I will do shortly, you're going to be doing one of two things. You're going to be either adding fuel to the car or subtracting fuel to the car to dial it in. And we've already discussed some of the reasons that you would do that. I think, briefly we kind of glazed over them. But the best idea is to get more specific as to why you'd be out there in your chip adding or subtracting fuel. So while I can't list all the reasons you would do that, I think that these are the most common reasons that would be a reason you'd be getting into your chip, unlocking it, and changing the way that your car runs, even after you bought a chip that's already designed for your car. So because you could get a 5.7 chip from Turbo Tweak, stick it in the car, and still run into some of these problems that would cause you to go into the chip and add or subtract fuel. So if you look on the right column, I've got reasons that you would add fuel, and on the left I've had reasons that you would subtract fuel. And the real important part of this video is going to be going into the car and actually doing that. So if you stick around, we'll get to that part, but right now we need to talk about this part. So on the add fuel column, you can see that I wrote increase engine airflow. Now, when you increase the engine airflow, it could be because you've turned, as simple as you've turned the boost up. You could have 16, you could have, let's say, 18 pounds of boost, and you want to try to make 21 pounds of boost. Your fuel system's good, and you trust your chip and everything, and you just want to turn the boost up to make more power. Well, when more boost is going into the motor, it's going to be wanting to burn more fuel to compensate for more air coming in. So more air, you need more fuel. So you're going to go into your chip and you're going to add fuel with the chip. If you add modifications to the motor that makes it more of a free-flowing air pump and moves more air through the RPM range, again, more air flowing through the motor is going to require more fuel to burn to go along with it. So if you put heads or cam on your car, or you've changed an up pipe or mass air pipe, or I don't know, headers, whatever, or plenum, bigger throttle body, whatever's moving more air through the motor. If we go later on, we'll see on the wideband and on the ScanMaster how that's affected, but you may need to get in there and add some fuel to compensate for the more airflow through the motor. One of the reasons that I've had to change the fuel in my chip probably a million times is because of air quality. And again, we talked about that wideband gauge and how important it is. Without that wideband gauge, I never would have realized how much the air quality that you're driving around in affects the way your car runs. These cars have old computers in them from 1987, and while they were advanced for their time, they really don't process information fast enough to make fast corrections on fuel for things like air quality. So I've actually been out at night driving the car at 7 o'clock at night, and it's cool, it's a little cold out, it's probably in the 50s, and the car's running perfect. And don't you know, I'm out there for 2-3 hours, and next thing you know, it's 10 o'clock at night, and it's now in the 40s or 30s even, and the DA that's outside has changed, and the air is now thick and dense and cold, and it's that good winter turbo air. I make a pull under that, and I all of a sudden my air fuel goes from 10.8 to 11.3, and I might get some detonation, and I need to pull the car over into a parking lot, go into the chip and make a change and throw some more fuel out. And again, that's a reason to add fuel to the car to get the air fuel back down to where we want it to be, whether you're looking at the ScanMaster or the wideband, and we'll get to that. But air quality is an absolute reason you could find yourself going into the chip and changing the way that the fuel is responding to the air. The next thing is probably the biggest one, and again, people every single day on every message board and forum and Facebook and everything else, we're always talking about knock retard and detonation in the motor. A lot of times it's attributed to a false knock. Something could be rubbing, a down pipe in the frame or something like that, but it's very possible it's tune related. Going back to before when I said that my air quality changes and my car will lean out with the cold dense air, and it'll go to 11.3. If this car runs at 11.3 on the wideband, I'll get a couple degrees of knock retard, which is again the same reason as the one before it, to go in and add some fuel. Two things could be true at once. The air quality is causing knock retard, and I'm adding fuel because of those two things at one time. But if you're not doing this and you're not monitoring the way the car's running, and you're out there making knock retard and scratching your head and you can't figure out why, I've seen it in real time because I have all the proper gauges and tools, and my information center in this car is really productive. It helps me figure out exactly how this car's working all the time. So basically, to sum it up, you're adding fuel because there's not enough fuel in the car, and that's pretty simple, obviously. You're basically just putting more fuel in it. Again, to elaborate on that, when I say not enough fuel, I mean you could be looking at your wideband gauge or your ScanMaster and coming up with numbers that would indicate that there's not enough fuel in the car. And that's what I mean by not enough fuel, because you have some sort of information telling you that, some evidence to support that there's not enough fuel. And going over to the subtract side on the left column, these are reasons we would go into the chip and we would subtract fuel. It's basically the complete opposite. If you were to decrease the engine airflow, the motor's not going to process fuel the same way it would, let's say, with 30 pounds of boost as it would with 20 pounds of boost. Now all of a sudden the motor's not using nearly as much fuel, it's not consuming the fuel. So you're going to have a real rich car, and you're going to have to go into your ScanMaster and your chip and subtract the fuel out of it. I've actually recently, I was doing a video a couple weeks ago, I'm sure maybe you guys have seen it, where I was just kind of doing the walk around on the car and showing what the car looks like and what the mods are. And that day, I was actually working on some of this video, although I've completely changed the whole idea for this video. But at the time I was working on what I thought would have been a good example for this video, and the air was awful. It was like 90 degrees out, thick, humid air, and the car went real rich because it just wasn't processing that garbage air. And on my gauges, I was just seeing an overflow of fuel. So it would have been a good time to go into the car and make a fuel adjustment to pull some fuel out of it, because the car just felt like a pig. It was slow, it was really unresponsive. It would have been, that air quality would have been a reason to go into and subtract some fuel from the chip, which goes down to the next one. It's slow performance. If your car is not performing to your standards, and you have information from your gauges telling you that there's just an abundance of fuel that you don't need, you'd go into your chip and subtract some fuel. The age-old saying, you've probably heard it, is that leaner is meaner. So you want to lean the car out. So you're subtracting fuel to lean it out to make it a little bit more mean and run a little bit more efficiently. If you're making pulls with the car and you're like, man, this thing, it runs really good, but I think it could make more performance. You're not getting any knock on your Scan Master. It's showing you no knock retard. Heck, pull some fuel out of it and try to lean the car out. These are reasons that you would subtract fuel. And at the bottom, I wrote too much fuel, and that just means that you have information to support that there's too much fuel in the car. You're reading a gauge, whether it's the Scan Master or you're reading your wideband and your air fuel, and it's just showing you with a model that you have just entirely too much fuel in the car. So you're going to go in and subtract fuel. This is my fuel pressure regulator. It came from Carbon Performance. And we talked about the fuel pressure regulator and what its job is to do. They're pretty easy to tune, these things. I'll show you the result of tuning one in a minute or shortly, but there's a jam nut on here. And it's usually I think it's a 7/16 jam nut. So when you loosen that jam nut, you'll be able to turn this little screw right here with an Allen wrench. And when you back the screw in or back the screw out, you'll be changing the fuel pressure to get your base fuel pressure set. So if that's something that you're not familiar with, I could definitely make a video on that as well. Just let me know. But I'm going to assume that you know how to set your fuel pressure in the car. If you don't have a fuel pressure gauge in your car, this is a makeshift way that people have done it for years, and I've actually used this for a long time. It's pretty simple. This connection right here will connect to your fuel rail. You can see I have my electronic fuel pressure sensor on the fuel rail now, but if I unhook that, take the Schrader valve out of the center of it with a Schrader valve tool, you can connect one of these 90-degree number 4, I believe it's a number 4 AN line, and on the other end you connect mechanical fuel pressure gauge. And this is up to 100 pounds. You obviously need up to 100 pounds in a fuel injected car. And what you would do is you would run this right up to the window, and you would just shut the hood on it. And when you're inside the car, you'd be able to see that gauge. And you'd be able to read your fuel pressure at idle and your fuel pressure at wide open throttle. So these are some of the gauges that I'm going to use as my tools, as my information gathering tools to do this job, to work on tuning this car. And right off the bat, you'll see the fuel pressure gauge. We talked about setting fuel pressure with the regulator, and you'll use the gauge to do that. And we'll also use it for something that's even more important than setting base fuel pressure shortly. I have a boost gauge here. You probably already, if you're watching this video and you have a Grand National, you probably already have a boost gauge. So whether you have this kind or one with vacuum in it, you're in good shape. These are actually two of the most important information gathering devices for this job, or we'll call them tools. This is a Scan Master and a air fuel gauge, which is otherwise known as a wideband. The factory has an O2 sensor in the header, and it actually reads what's called a narrow band. So it gives you O2 millivolts. So most people have a Scan Master and they tune the car, or they watch O2 millivolts to make sure that the car is not running too lean or too rich. So if you're one of the more advanced guys, or have a Turbo Buick for a while and you're watching your Scan Master, then you know kind of what numbers you should be looking for on your Scan Master, because it's reading the O2 millivolts out of the header. I'll get into why I don't really like that, and it took me a long time to realize that that is not the best way to be tuning your car shortly. But the other gauge I have here is a wideband, and the difference is that a wideband is post-engine exhaust. It's not pre-exhaust, it's post-exhaust, so it's coming out of your downpipe, and it's about 6 inches away from the turbo, and I'll show you that in just a second. But what this allows me to do is read the proper air and fuel mixture that the motor is creating and sending out of the exhaust after it's already burnt. So you can really see what kind of a tune you have in there by reading the wideband. Now, I realize not everybody's going to go to the store or go online and buy a wideband and get into the car and hook a wideband up. But if there's anything that I can tell you over the last 4 years of owning this car, I'd say about 2 years of owning the previous car, and growing up around these cars since the 90s and being in and out of probably 15, 20 of them. My family's had them and my friends have had them. And what I can tell you is that this wideband is probably the most important tool I've ever put into this car under any circumstance. I learned so much more about this car the minute I put a wideband into it. Everything made a lot more sense. And I now understand a whole lot more that you can do. The car's a lot more predictable, and you really have to be a problem solver when you have these cars, because you have problems with fuel curves and air and stuff like that. And this is a great problem solving tool to figure out what in the world's going on with the car. So we're going to show you more of this gauge in just a minute. Just wanted to point out something about that wideband. So if people don't have wideband gauges in their car, they might ask a little bit further, like how easy is it to hook up, or is it something that anybody can just throw into their car? It's not a big deal, or is it something that's a little bit more complicated? The biggest thing about a wideband is that it needs to run its own oxygen sensor, and that oxygen sensor needs to be in the actual exhaust flow out of the motor. That's where your factory one's in the factory header, reading before the turbo. So this one's reading after the turbo. So I have a performance aftermarket downpipe on here from TA Performance. They make them, downpipes. GN1 makes downpipes. RJC makes downpipes. And most aftermarket downpipes will have a bung already welded in to the downpipe. And you can see that right here. That bung comes pre-welded into this downpipe and capped off. So when you put the downpipe on the car, I've actually had that capped off for a good year and a half. And then when I got the wideband, I took the cap off and I screwed this oxygen sensor into it. That oxygen sensor is a wire that runs right through into my firewall and into my center console. And what that does, obviously, is just, it's a signal. It sends and receives the information from the exhaust flow into my center console and tells me how it's reading on the air fuel gauge. Some people just weld their own little bung. You can get a bung for really cheap off of Summit or something, and you can weld it into a pre-existing exhaust or downpipe. I've seen people put them down underneath the car. You know, really whatever works, but this is probably the absolute best case scenario, is that it's in a downpipe about 10 inches away from the turbo. So that's my wideband setup. So one of the things we're going to do before we go out and drive the car and get some real data is verify the base fuel pressure. Now when you get a chip, it's going to be in the chip instructions for your car how the chip designer wants the fuel pressure set for the base fuel pressure. What's standard across the board, in my opinion, is usually around 44 pounds of fuel pressure with the vacuum line disconnected from the regulator. And that's how you'll set your base fuel pressure. So we'll do that now. We'll just check. I think mine is spot on. It should be. I check it pretty often, but this is how you're going to do it. This vacuum line right here needs to come off the regulator, and I've already cut the zip line. You should have a zip tie on all your lines. So this line comes off the regulator and allows you now to check your fuel pressure. Inside the car. So you can see where the amount of pressure would be if the line was on. But since we removed the vacuum line, you'll see that number jump to a higher number now. We're probably around 43 pounds with the line off. And that seems to be working for me. I haven't had any fuel pressure related issues, so I'm going to leave it right there. But 42 to 44 is the common place where you should see your fuel pressure set. So for the purposes of this video, when I go out to tune the car, which will be in a minute, I don't want to get in a situation where I'm pushing the car and I have to add fuel to it because I'm turning up the boost, or abusing the car to a point where we got to throw more fuel at it to compensate. That's going to get me in a situation where I could be hurting or damaging the car for the purpose of this video. That's not what I want to do. So I'm going to go over to the left side of this column where it says subtract fuel, and I'm going to find a reason right now where we want to subtract fuel from the program, and then I'll show you how to do that in the chip. So I've put a star next to decrease engine airflow, which means basically I'm going to go out and lower the boost. And there's a couple reasons I'm going to do that. Right now the boost is probably set to around 27 pounds of boost, and I want to lower it down to somewhere in the low 20s, because number one, you'll see the second star, poor air quality. Number one, the air quality is really poor right now. We're getting into summer and we have a lot of heat and humidity and bad DA numbers. So I want to turn the boost and the power down so the car is not consuming all of that negative quality air. Because of that, I'm going to end up with slow performance because I've lowered the boost, and now the car has way too much fuel going in it, because this chip is designed by design for 27 pounds of boost. It has a lot of fuel added to it. So we're going to go into the computer and subtract some of that fuel out of there. And again, at the bottom, it's just, you're going to see that there's going to be entirely too much fuel after I lower the boost down. So another reason I'm going to do this is because of the weather. It's summer and my kids are off of school, and my wife sometimes tends to want to take the car out if I'm not around, or if I'm at work, and she'll go in the garage and take it for a ride with the kids. And I really don't want it to be some high performance level where it might not be the safest thing for her to get into the gas pedal too much. So I think at a lower boost number and a softer tune, it should be a little safer for that. So stay tuned and we'll get out on the road and I'll show you how to verify some of these things in the actual car. I do think it's important to add to this chart some numbers, because when I go out there and I show you what you'll see on the gauges, you should know what you're looking at as far as numbers. So you can see on the right, under the words add fuel, these are some of the numbers you'd see on your ScanMaster that would cause you to want to add fuel. So on your ScanMaster, if you hit the playback and you see 600, that means that thing is really lean and you've got to add fuel to it. If you see 650 or 680, you're still looking at numbers that, if you did have a wideband, would be in the 11s, which is, again, lean. And my car does have knock retard and detonation in those numbers. So you'd be adding fuel in the chip for those numbers. Really, anything up to 720 and 750, those aren't really the safest places to be. Unless you're not making a lot of power and you want to just kind of run it on the lean edge to go fast and make power, you can run it at 720, 750. I've heard people say that they've ran their cars in the 600s, which to me is extremely lean, and I'm not sure what the reasoning for that is. I would throw fuel at something like that to safeten it up. On the wideband gauge, if you see numbers higher than 11, so if you're seeing 12.5 or 12.1, 11.5, 11.3, or 11.1, that's all lean territory for a turbo car, or for a Grand National for that matter. These cars don't work well in the 11s. They need to get down into the 10s. My car really responds well to fuel. So for me, again, 10.8 is the perfect number. On the left side, you'll see under the subtract fuel what kind of numbers you'd see on your ScanMaster that are telling you that the car is too rich and you need to subtract some fuel out of it to lean it out. So with the ScanMaster, if it's super rich and it's taken just a kind of a BS snapshot of that rich condition, sometimes it might just do a 999. But if you're seeing anything in the 900s or in the high to mid 800s, you're getting into that rich territory, like low 10s on your wideband, 10.0, 10.3, and 10.5, which are pretty fairly rich numbers. Now 10.5 and 880 on a ScanMaster is probably really safe, but nobody really runs them like that. You try to get down to the low 800s, like 800 or 10.8 on your wideband on your ScanMaster. So if you have a ScanMaster and you're looking for a snapshot, the number you're usually looking for is around 800, maybe like 790 to 820 is the safe place. That's going to put you in the high 10s with air fuel ratio out of a wideband. The first thing I'm going to do is verify where the boost and the fuel are right now, make sure the fuel pressure is responding to boost. It needs to rise 1 to 1. So if it's at 40 now, it needs to add another 27 pounds of fuel pressure to that if there's 27 pounds of boost. So let's see what's happening. So we got our baseline. Looks like the boost is a good bit over 25, 27 pounds. Fuel pressure seems to be rising as it should, so fuel pressure regulator's working. That has to happen. Now let's get an idea of where the air fuel ratio is under wide open throttle. So we're going to be making changes to all this stuff.
so after that pass, we saw 10.5, which is a pretty safe number for a hot day like today. If it got a little cooler, we would want to lean it out to about 10.8, where the car can make its most power. This car seems to run its best when it's at 10.8. Now, if I look at my O2 playback from the millivolts from the O2 sensor that's reading out of the header, I get 800. Now, I don't like that number. To me, I can't make any decisions based off of 800. I guess we can lean it out and make it 10.8 and get that number to 780. The problem that I have with ScanMasters is that if I made the same pass 3 times, this wideband might read 10.5 all 3 times, as where this might read 800, it might read 830, it might read 780, it might read 810. Depending on how many times I pull it, it's never a consistent result from that millivolt. Mostly because I don't think it gives you a sample rate that's fast enough. I think it just catches numbers through the course of the pull, and it just snapshots one and gives it to you. So you might get inconsistent readings, but it's hard to make decisions on tuning the car based off that millivolt number, and that's why I think everybody should not be tuning off this. You should be tuning off of one of these. Okay, now we kind of know where this car is. We know where the boost is. We know that the fuel pressure is working. We know that our air fuel is down at 10.5. We read our ScanMaster. We don't have any knock to worry about. So everything's fine here. But again, the whole purpose of this is to turn the boost down and weaken the car up a little bit so it's safer for this hot summer weather and safer for the wife to take out to drive. So let's turn the boost down now. Okay, here's my boost controller. For some reason it lives right here in this little spot. And on mine, you unlock this knob here. And if you turn it clockwise all the way, it will lower the boost down to the heavy-duty wastegate spring, which is about 18 pounds. So I brought it all the way down, then I backed it out about 3 turns because I'm hoping to get at least 20, but I'd be lucky if I got 21 or 22, and I'd even settle for 23. So let's see where that's at. This thing turned out to be somewhat stubborn. It took me a few tries, but I think we got it where we want. We were looking for about 20 to 21. Okay, now that the boost has been lowered down, I'm seeing about 22. It's kind of finding itself at 22 pounds, and that's pretty much what I wanted. Let's take a look at the air fuel and see if it's real rich now. It needs to lean out. Yeah, that's way too rich. 10.0 is not what we want. We want more like 10.8. So we're going to show you how to pull some fuel out of it and lean the car out a little bit to make it make some more power at this boost level. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back in my garage right now, and let's recap what we did so far. We took the car out. We saw 27 pounds of boost, and air fuel was around 10.5. We brought the boost down to 22 pounds. And then we saw it go pig rich. It actually went to 10.0, but I actually was thinking about it on the ride home, and this gauge I think pegs out at 10.0, so it could have actually been dipping into the 9s. And we don't want that. That's pig rich. The car will not run good like that. It's not made to be running like that. So we're going to go through the process of taking fuel out of it and leaning the car out to get to that target 10.8 number that we're looking for, so that even though the boost is lower now at 22 pounds, it's still going to be really responsive, real snappy, and run real good at 22 pounds for this bad weather. So just to talk about ScanMasters for a minute, this is the old-fashioned ScanMaster that just about everybody has or has had at one point. This car came with one. I've had them in the past. It's no different than one I have here today, which is the ScanMaster G. It's the same thing, just put into a smaller gauge. This does have more capabilities. I think if you do have a power logger or something, it has, I believe it has a 5-volt reference that you can tie a power logger into and read air fuel right out of the ScanMaster, which maybe someday I'll get to doing. But right now I'm just using it for the standard ScanMaster features. So I'm going to turn it on right now, and I'm going to show you how we're going to tune this car and take some fuel out and lean it out. Okay, we turned the key on. My fan's coming on and off, so that's kind of loud. You can see that it's connecting. And now we have the functional ScanMaster on. Okay, so in order to tune and change the parameters of the chip, you can change the fuel and you can change the timing. That's it. And here's how you'll do it. This function right here, which is LV8, It is a dead function when the key's on and the car is off, but it does give you the ability to use it to unlock the fuel and the timing tables of this Turbo Tweak chip that I have. And here's how you're going to do that. Okay, so here's the gas pedal. Move your floor mat out of the way. You don't want that blocking it. And you're going to do 1, 2, and on the third one, you're going to hold it. You're going to watch this go in from 0 to 1, and I let off. Okay, so now that we've unlocked function 1, which we talked about as the low gear fuel, overall wide open throttle fuel across the board, this is going to be the main tuning parameter to go in and add or subtract fuel like we talked about. If you hold the pedal down and you keep going, that number will turn from 2 to 3 and then to 4. 2, 3, and 4 are some of the other parameters that we talked about, which are first gear fuel, 1, 2 timing, and 3, 4 timing. We're not going to go into those because that's going to be more advanced tuning that we're not going to do. We're just going to stay in this function 1. This function 1 is going to be wide open throttle fuel. Now let's see how we go in and we make a change to that. You're going to switch from this function, LV8, over to your BLM, which is your Block Learn Manager. Now, typical driving conditions, you'll see this number hover around 128. 128 means it's not adding or subtracting fuel. It's got an adequate amount of fuel and a good tune going. Now, we have it in here set at 128. That's going to be your baseline. So when you get a chip, you put the chip in, the chip will always start out at 128. I could tell you why in words this is at 128, but I think it would be more beneficial to show you where it's at now at 128 and then what needs to happen in order to add or subtract fuel. So let's take an actual look at that.
So looking back at our illustration that we had, I added something right dead in the middle of it, and that's the number 128. And the reason I did that was because we came across the number 128 on the ScanMaster. So before going into the ScanMaster and changing that number to add or subtract fuel, I figured I would show it to you on this model so you can understand why the number is 128. 128 is the baseline. It's what the chip manufacturer sets. So as soon as you go into a brand new chip, when you open up that portal for that fuel, it's going to always start out at 128. That's the baseline. So now if you look to the right, it'll show you that going to increasing the number 128 will be adding fuel to the program. And you can see it goes all the way up to the number 154. 154 is the maximum amount of fuel you can add to the chip. So if you go 130, 134, 138, 140s, all the way through the 154, you'd be adding a maximum of 20% of fuel to your program. So if you go the other direction, all the way down to 104, that's where you'll see the maximum of subtracted fuel from the chip. So it could be anywhere from 116, 118. Now, one of the things you'll see when I do go in and make a change, since we still have to do that, we have to subtract some fuel because the car was totally rich. One of the things that you'll see is that in order to get down to the lower subtraction side, we actually have to go through the full addition side. So we have to go from 128 all the way to 154 and then let the number start over again at 104 and work our way back up again towards 128. Now, we're not going to stop at 128. We're going to stop at a lower number because we're going to be subtracting some fuel out of here. So at the end of the day, we're going to start here at 128. We're going to try to end up somewhere around maybe 115 or 118 because that'll be pulling some fuel out, and then we'll go check and drive the car and make sure that we've removed enough fuel to get our number from that entirely rich number of 10.0 or possibly even worse back up to the 10.8 that's the target that we're looking for. Another thing I did here was just make a quick notation of what we saw on our wideband gauge, which was we started out at 10.5, which was still a little on the safe side. We could have subtracted a little bit of fuel to make that perfect, but instead we decided to lower the boost down by a certain amount of boost. I forget, about 5 or 8 pounds, whatever it was. And then we saw the car actually add a whole lot more fuel because now it wasn't burning as much fuel. So we went down, you can see the arrow pointing over to the 10.0, or again, possibly even richer than that, because I don't know if the gauge will register into the 9s or even 8s. Our goal here is going to be to take this 128 number down to probably around 118 and then hope to get that all the way on the left over to 10.0 and bring that number back towards the middle line, which we're looking for, which is 10.8.
Okay, back in the car, you can see the 128 is still up on the screen. And now we're going to change that. Like I said, you're going to have to go all the way up to 154. And that's an approximate number. I think it's 154. We're going to have to watch it start all over again at 104 and work our way back up. Now to do that, I'm just holding down the gas pedal to the floor. And you can see it's going to go slowly up to that number. I might speed this up with an edit, so you'll see it go a little bit faster. I'm not sure. Okay, so we've arrived at 119. We started at 128, and we've subtracted some fuel because we went backwards to 119, like you saw on the diagram. I went all the way up to what I think was 152, and it started over at 102 and worked its way up. But here we are at 119, so there's probably a good percentage of fuel now subtracted from this program here. And you'll see that when we take a ride in the car, and we'll check the wideband again and make sure that we're going from that entirely rich 10.0 up to the number we're looking for. Now sometimes this is trial and error. I'd like to point out that there's no specific number that equals anything. It's not like two numbers on here are equal to 3 or 5% of fuel. It doesn't work that way. It's pretty trial and error when it comes to the fuel. Now on the other hand, the timing, if you go into the 3 or the 4 and you start working with the timing, there actually is a mathematical equation to that. It's actually 0.33 is one number. So for 3 numbers, you would get pretty much 1 degree of timing. So if you went from 128 to 131, you'd probably have added around 1 degree of timing. So the timing has a specific number programmed to it, but the fuel does not. It's trial and error. In order to save this number, it's very simple. We're just going to turn the key off. Okay, the key is completely off. It is in my hand. I'll put the key back in, and let's check this thing. One, two, hold on the third, and we'll stop at 1. We're going to go back over to BLM. And as you can see, the fuel has set right where we want it at 119. So that I always double check these things because sometimes I'm afraid I'll go out and start beating on the car and it didn't set. And again, if we're going the other way and it was too lean, that would be a problem. You obviously don't want to be out there beating on the car if it's too lean. So I go in and I double check with a second shot at it like we did right now and see that it's set at 119. So I'm going to put the shifter back in park. I'm going to turn the key and take it out, and it's going to set that number at 119. I'm back in the car here for another pull now that we've made an adjustment on the fuel. And let's see if we get the 10.8 we're looking for. Okay, we've definitely taken some fuel out. We went from that 10.0 situation where we thought we were entirely too rich to looked like I saw about 10.4, maybe 10.5. So we're going back in the right direction. We're back at 10.5 where we started. But again, now that the boost is lower, we want the car to perform well, so we're going to lean it out a little bit more and get to 10.8. But before I do that, let me just check the ScanMaster recall. Okay, so ScanMaster is showing me 785. 785 is safe. 10.4 is safe, but we're going to lean it out just a little bit more. And you can see how the ScanMaster number is a little bit contradictory to the wideband, and I don't like that. I really rely on this wideband at 10.4, 10.5 to tell me I can take fuel out. If I only had that ScanMaster to show me 785, I probably would stop there and say I don't want to go to 750 or 760. I don't think that's safe. But because I have this wideband, I know for sure that it is completely safe at 10.5, and we can even take more out. Another thing we could check is to make sure there's no knock retard. We have 0 degrees of knock retard, which means we're completely healthy and it's not detonating in any way, shape, or form, so we can pull some more fuel out of this thing. I'm going to shut the car off and I'm going to make the adjustment that's necessary. We were at 119, so I'm going to have to go all the way back around through the 128 to the 154, back around again, and I'm probably going to bring this thing to about 114, maybe 115, and see if that has pulled enough fuel out of here to get us back to 10.8. Okay, car back on side of the road tuning here. We've brought it down from 119 to 114, so we've taken even a little bit more fuel out of the car. Let's go try that. Okay, so we started at 119. We came out, made a pull, and it was around 10.4, 10.5. We pulled over, we brought it down to 114, so we took more fuel out. You just saw I made 2 straight pulls in a row, and they were both at around 10.5. So even though I pulled some fuel out via the chip, it's not reflecting on this wideband here. It's still showing me that my fuel is exactly the same at about 10.5. And we're looking for 10.8. Part of the reason for that is I think the air quality is real poor right now. It's a hot, muggy summer day, and I think it's just not really responding well to pulling fuel out of it. It's just not consuming fuel in the motor because the air's bad. So we're getting a rich condition. So I'm actually brought the ScanMaster down to 110. I pulled just a little bit more fuel, and if that doesn't, get to that 10.8, we're just going to leave it alone because later tonight, when the weather gets a little bit better, it'll probably lean out on its own. But one thing I turned the car off quicker than I would have liked to, and I wanted to capture that. On one of those 2 pulls that I made where it went to 10.5 a second ago, it took a ScanMaster snapshot on my playback, and it showed 8.35. So we were at 7.65. Nothing changed. It's the same 10.5 on both passes, but on the second time it went to 8.35. It just goes to show you how inconsistent a ScanMaster snapshot reading can be. It's definitely not a good way to be tuning this car. It's old-fashioned, it's outdated. This wideband is showing you in real time where the air-fuel ratio of the car is. So let's go take one last pass, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, we just got back to the garage. It looks like on the last pull we hit our target 10.8 number. Car felt good. It's not rich, it's not lean, it's right at that 10.8 number. And on ScanMaster, we're showing 792. So we went from 70 or 80 up to 830 and then back to 792. So this ScanMaster is all over the place. Again, it's really hard for me to make decisions off those snapshots. We also have no 0 knock retard. So we're at 10.8 on the air fuel. We're at 0 knock retard. Who cares what this stupid ScanMaster says? If you have one, I probably would just, use it as a tuning tool, which is what I'm doing now. Using it as a gateway into my computer system. And I'm using this wideband here to tune this car. And back at this board, we started at 128. We went down to 114, we went down to, or 119, then down to 114, and then down to, I believe, 110. At 110, we pulled enough fuel out of the car to go from 10.0 to 10.5 to 10.8, which was our target number. So it took a lot of, again, this was all the way down to 104, is 20% of the fuel out of the computer. It's removing 20% of the fuel from the target number that your chip manufacturer has made. So if we went down to 104, we would have pulled all 20% available to us out. But we stopped at 110, so we're talking maybe 15% of the fuel we reduced because that's how rich we went after we lowered the boost from 27 pounds to 22 or 23 pounds. Remember, it went rich. It went from 10.5 to 10.0. The more we pulled fuel out, we went back to 10.5 again, back up to 10.8 where we want to be. So I wiped the board clean, and I've just added a few quick things here before I end this. On the left side, you'll see 2 chips, a 27 PSI chip, which is what's in the car, and a 23 PSI chip, which I showed you earlier when I dumped them out of the bag.
The reason that we had to do this and go in and change that fuel so drastically and pull all that fuel out of there was because the chip that's in there has more fuel in it. It's just a chip loaded with fuel because it's looking for a ton of boost. So obviously when I lowered the boost down to 23 pounds or 22 pounds, I had to take all the fuel out of that chip. Look how far I had to go. I had to go almost 20%. And if I would have went a full 20%, I probably would have got to that 10.8 number I was looking for. You can see down at the bottom, I went from 10.0 to 10.3 to 10.5 and to 10.6 after I'm looking back at the videos. I never really made it to 10.8. I would have had to have probably pulled all the fuel out of that chip to get to my 10.8 number. The fast track to this would be to take the 27 PSI chip out of the car and put the 23 PSI chip in the car, because that would have already been, starting out, 20% fuel, less fuel than the higher boost chip. So that would have been the easy way to do this, would be to take the chip that's in the car out and switch it out for the 23 PSI chip. But because these chips are adjustable, and the whole goal of this video was to show you how to adjust the chip, I use it as an example to adjust all the fuel out of the big chip so that I can make smaller boost with it. So that's kind of the whole reason that I did that. I definitely could have changed it out and put the 23 PSI chip in there. Also on the right side, I wanted to address the fact that this whole video, we didn't show you about adding any fuel. All we did was talk about subtracting fuel. And I told you why we would do that earlier in the video. But just for a quick example, if you would have went out on that highway and stepped on the car and it went to 11.5, and you might have even seen 2 degrees of knock retard on the ScanMaster, that's a situation where you would have went from your 128 base setting and you would have added numbers. For example, you would have went to maybe 135 because you're adding fuel, and you would have knocked that 11.5 number back down to 10.8. You'd just be going the other direction. So you'd be adding fuel, adding numbers in the chip from 128, and you would try to knock your number from 11.5 and 2 degrees of knock retard down to 10.8 and 0 degrees of knock retard. So those are just a few things that I wanted to point out before going further. In conclusion, I want to add 4 small things. I know this has been a long video and I hope you made it through it. Hopefully this could be beneficial to somebody watching. But number 1, always make sure that your gas gauge has realistically at least a half a tank of gas in it. You really don't want to be out beating up this car and tuning it with a quarter tank of gas in it. Don't go wide open throttle with no gas in the car. That is just a real stupid, easy mistake, real rookie mistake to make. You can lose a head gasket, all kinds of things can happen just by beating on the car with no gas in it. I know it sounds crazy, but some of these floor mats out here, mine specifically from ACC, the nice big thick Grand National mats, you have to move them out of the way. They really do block your TPS from going to a full voltage. You really shouldn't be tuning the car with, or racing or doing anything with a floor mat in the way. So always move that floor mat out of the way. And to be honest with you, your transmission TV cable heavily relies on hitting a full position to the floor. So anytime you're beating on this car, think about your transmission and the longevity of it and get that floor mat out of the way. And of course, if you have an alky car, always make sure that alky tank, not to the full line, because that's not enough. It needs to be to the top of the tank. You never want to run short on alcohol. This car launches back, it's going to pull all the alcohol away from the bottom of that little sump that's at the bottom of it. Make sure you have a full tank of alcohol. Number 2, some of those ScanMaster numbers I gave were approximate. Obviously, you see from the way that ScanMaster reacts with inconsistencies and unpredictability that I had to be approximate with those numbers, because you really never know what you're going to get. The ScanMaster is just really turbulent with its results. Number 3, this video really was for a beginner approach to these cars. Some people do know exactly what I'm doing here with this chip and have been doing it. Some people do not. Some people do not know how to get into their chip and read a wideband and get the car dialed in. What we just did is really dial the car in, and it's really helpful to keeping this car running well. And number 4, I wrote share, because I'm not looking for subscribers or likes or really anything for that matter. But what I would say is that, you know, if this video can be helping people out there learn about their car, then if you see someone, you know, struggling on a forum or a board or on social media, just share this to them so that they can get some information for help purposes. That's really why I made it. So thanks for watching. Look at all those victims.